Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Life Science Rundown, the podcast where we discuss current regulatory complexities facing the life science industry and explore innovative ways to overcome those challenges. I am your host, Nicholas Catman, President and CEO of the FDA Group. Before we get started, here is a quick word about who we are. The FDA Group is a consulting firm that helps life science companies in the areas of regulatory submissions, audit projects, mock inspections, staff augmentation, and remediation. So if you ever find yourself in need, just head over to the fdagroup.com to check us out and get in touch. So today I'm speaking with Jackie Klecker. Hey, Jackie, how are you?
Hi, Nicholas. Fine. How are you?
Doing excellent. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to get into today's discussion. Before we touch on the topic, would you kindly introduce yourself?
I will. Thank you. I'm Jackie Klecker. I'm the Executive Vice President and Head of Quality and Head of Development Services here at Lifecore Biomedical. Um, Lifecore has been around 60 years now, and we are a fully integrated CDMO. We do really specialty formulation, aseptic filling into vials, syringes, cartridges. We also do med device and pharmaceutical drug products along with some biologics. We have about 20 commercial SKUs, FDA and Europe right now. That's our CDMO side, and we also produce a sodium hyaluronate API, which is our product and used throughout the world.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. So we will be talking about how scaling from preclinical to clinical and then to commercial, it can be a daunting task. And we want to understand how can sponsors ensure that they're asking the right questions to build robust processes while incorporating phase-appropriate approaches, especially when getting it right saves time, resources, and money. So to start, like I mentioned, scaling that product from preclinical to commercial, it can really seem like a monumental task. From your experience, what are the most common missteps companies make during this transition?
It's a good question. What I've seen is some of the sponsors would come in with their preclinical solutions and they would be requesting us to validate analytical methods fully, for example. That's a very expensive endeavor and not necessarily needed at preclinical as the sponsor continues to understand their product. So that's an example of the sponsor asking for too much information. Um, I've also seen the other side of it where the sponsor will come in and really doesn't understand the design space of the solution they're providing to us.
Hmm.
So it's they haven't really done the design testing. There isn't the understanding of what are the material variability attributes, or even, if there's a specification for pH, is that the right spec? Should it be different? Will it be more stable if it's different? So those type of things. And we're looking at it we're looking at the preclinical as a commercial product. So we're also looking at things like what equipment is being used, what process is being used. So sometimes early on, those things aren't optimized. So that's really where understanding those optimization of processes, material variability, and really what is your design space that's critical for your product really comes into play.
Makes sense. Um, let's talk about structured knowledge transfer tools and how that could help early phase teams identify risks that otherwise might be overlooked. What advice would you give to sponsors as it pertains to that?
Yeah, for sponsor advice, I really think it's important for the sponsor to share with the CDMO the information they know. For example, there may be things that are critical to the solution that they know, and maybe they don't articulate it because they're so used to that solution. A CDMO, every CDMO has things they are good at and they're very knowledgeable at. And so it's really trying to get what does the CDMO know about the various process steps, and what does the sponsor know, and how do we move that information together? So an example of moving that information would be to really understand what is the process that the CDMO or that the sponsor is currently using on the solution that they provide to the CDMO, and how do you put that in a structured way early on that the CDMO and the sponsor then can communicate on, here's what's critical, here's what we know, and just as importantly, here's what we don't know. And again, I think looking at the variability of materials is critical, especially of the API. A lot of sponsors come and they've only used one lot for their API at the preclinical stage. So I think that's a deep dive conversation that's important. Also, the sponsor and the CDMO working together to define what are the critical process parameters to know that at the end, I want this product requirements. Well, in the middle, I know that it'll change because of ETO processing step may change the solution because of the nature of that processing. So it's really looking at kind of a holistic view of the product attributes that's known, both sides looking at what they consider their knowledge, expertise, and really writing it down and documenting, starting early and using it throughout the program to the commercial.
Yeah, that's very prudent advice. What about quality design principles in early phase development? What would you say are some practical examples of defining a design space effectively?
Yeah, I mentioned the concept of what are the things that can alter the product. Again, from the sponsor, typically at preclinical, the sponsor will be the one saying, hey, I know that if you leave it out under light, we will have breakdown of product. So knowing what those sensitivities are, those are what we go after, and we use or you can use a design of experiments approach, looking at the criticality of the impact and then creating a test, stretching, maybe it's material variability, maybe it's light sensitivity, but really creating a DOE plan to really dig into where those design space cliffs are. And that again is a conversation between a CDMO with their knowledge of their filling capability and the sponsor, which has their knowledge of probably a smaller scale production.
Yep. When a product moves into later clinical or commercial phases, how do tools like FMEA become critical?
Yeah, I believe the FMEA is probably the most critical body of knowledge document that a product can have. And I know it's a concept more familiar for med device people, but with our med device experience and having a pharmaceutical experience, it's the same type of question. So the FMEA can be used to say, here are all the process steps, here are the, from formulation to filling to packaging to serialization, and saying, here are the controls that a CDMO would have in hand. Here are the things the sponsor knows could impact the critical quality attributes. I mentioned light, for example, or oxygen sensitivity, that kind of thing. And at a very early stage, you start documenting it. And then what can be done with the FMEA is as you gain knowledge, you can either say that line, let's say you have a failure mode for light sensitivity, and one of those process steps that could impact that is formulation. You can then say, well, in formulation, the light sensitivity is reduced because we do it in an enclosed container. At filling, that light sensitivity may be at a higher risk because it's done in a clear glass container and there's some exposure. So it's really taking all those process background that the CDMO and sponsor started with, putting it into the formalized FMEA template, which gives a really nice approach where you can update the occurrence ranking, for example, by saying, because we lower the light in the room, the occurrence now drops. And that FMEA then becomes, you update it through the life. And an FMEA is very nice because you can also update it with complaint information. with your CAPAs. If you have a failure down the road when you're producing a product and you have a new failure mode,
Hmm.
you can add another line, ensure you've done the appropriate work to make sure it won't happen again. But if that FMEA becomes kind of the life cycle encyclopedia for that product.
Yep, yep, that makes a lot of sense. Let's move into how teams should decide which risk management tools to apply at different stages. Because I'm sure, we want to avoid over-engineering, but then also under-preparing. So what advice would you have?
Yeah, that's a really good one, especially people new. I'll use the FMEA as an example. People new to an FMEA, I've seen the team get a little off scope and they suddenly put in, what if a tornado hits the facility?
Sure.
You know, and obviously that's not something anyone in the room can support. So with FMEAs, one of the critical things I've seen is really to say, what is the scope of this FMEA? What failure mode are we looking at? What product perhaps? And for example, with the FMEA, it may be the sponsor is responsible for the bulk drug substance.
Hmm.
That would then be their scope. The CDMO's scope for an FMEA may be filling, and then there may be a separate FMEA for the packaging. So
Hmm.
the first thing is really getting a scope of what you're talking about. So you don't over-engineer it or under-engineer it. You really all have to agree on it. The second thing is the team. So with FMEAs that I've seen that are really successful, you have a cross-functional team that comes in that can provide different inputs rather than a really this typically smaller dedicated core team that's working on the product. And a lot of times, especially with the early phase products, getting the sponsor involved where they're saying, oh yeah, I've seen that, hey, when we let it sit out at light, we see this type of degradation. So having the right cross-functional team, a team that I always believe that the team should be no larger than what fits in a minivan. You get too many people in there, it gets a little crazy. So
Hmm.
those would be a couple of things I would recommend for the FMEA risk
Yep,
assessment.
I would subscribe to that. How can sponsors ensure that they're leveraging a phase-appropriate regulatory framework so that early phase activities aren't overdone, but at the same time, later phase activities aren't underdone?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's always the tricky part. So I've talked about the body of knowledge of the product. I believe that having a body of knowledge, a consistent approach from a CDMO working with a sponsor on what are the expectations when we are doing this development program with 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 anyone. So, I believe a good CDMO would have a defined, here is here are the various phases from
Mhm.
preclinical, phase 1, 2, 3, and commercial. Here are what the expectations from the CDMO are to have for the body and knowledge of the product. For example, things like analytical method validation has to be done before phase 3.
Mm.
Or that may be a requirement from a CDMO, or it may be you have to have the bill of material fully into your appropriate system. Maybe that's by phase 2. So whatever it is, having a structured roadmap of these are what's expected, and then sharing that with the sponsor. I think that's important too, because a lot of preclinical sponsors may not have the experience of going through to a commercial product. So sharing with them with here is what's needed for the CDMO's quality management system, and here's why we will be asking for certain things at certain times.
Mhm.
So getting that alignment, I think, is really critical, CDMO and with the sponsor. So there's a marching together. The other thing I've seen that's been very useful is having those early scientific meetings with the FDA.
Mm.
that has saved time on things just to get the expectations out there. Do you need human factors? If you're doing a development or a medical device is a good example. Or do you need a certain hold study? Or here's, I'm talking more about the process, but obviously with working with the FDA, they'll have a lot of clinical guidance too. So having having that defined, or at least the vision, the roadmap of here's all the stuff the sponsor with the CDMO need to do to get to commercial, I think is a very valuable thing.
Yeah, I'm a huge supporter of meetings with FDA when things aren't crystal clear,
Yeah,
because then it can lead to added time, poor interactions in the
yeah,
future, and money, right? So
and money.
100%. Well, speaking about the FDA, what would you say are some of the differences between FDA and EU's expectations that maybe sometimes surprise teams?
Yeah, yeah, especially the sponsor, again, starting from preclinical may not have gone through this before, but I think one thing that's changed with the FDA recently is for med device programs, the FDA is now going more to the ISO 1345
Yep.
standard.
Hmm.
I think that will be very nice for for anyone with a medical device product, or CDMOs that work with it. What I've seen for some FDA and EU expectations that have been pretty dramatic, maybe I shouldn't say dramatic, that have been different, that impacted the project timing, are things like the EU Annex 13 tends to require more complete analytical methods at earlier phases. So, sponsors that are going to a clinical in Europe may want to be sensitive to that. They may want to pull in some of the analytical method validations and qualifications. The EU submissions tend to require more holding study data than FDA.
Hmm.
So if you don't have that, you submit to EU and you don't have that holding study, it delays it because you have to repeat that. Um, the other one is EU requires data from a completed PPQ, which this one is a pretty big deal for, again, timing. When you submit to the EU, they want all the PPQ data,
Hmm.
where with the FDA, for drugs anyway, you don't need the PPQ data. It can be in place, but you can submit protocols.
Right.
So that's timing for sure on that one. It seems like the EU also, it's they have, at least my experience is that they have more of a focus on data concerning the whole design space. So they want to see a development report showing that you have looked at various design edges. My experience is they've asked those questions more. Those are some of the responses they get when you submit to the EU. And that includes like product sterilization rationale, the whole PUPSIT, the whole documenting, well, why are you doing aseptic sterilization? Why not terminal sterilization? So the sponsor having those type of body of knowledge documents ready, and be able to justify their PUPSIT approach is something that can really decrease the amount of time once you have given a submission to the EU.
Got it. Got it. So one of the questions that I get a lot of is regarding QMS maturity, and some practical strategies for aligning that with well, actually, even before I jump into that, let me take a step back. Um, what does a quality management system need to evolve from early phase development through full commercial production? I know that's a big question a lot of sponsors have.
Yeah, and it's a good question. Um, CDMOs that are used to commercial production have a very robust, mature QMSs. It's because that's what you need for a full commercial product.
Hmm.
CDMOs that do more early clinical, especially preclinical, if you take your same QMS for the full commercial product and put that on top of a preclinical program, it's way too much. So I would argue that the CDMO that does preclinical and commercial has to have some type of clear document written with clear expectations on what's expected at the early phase preclinical, and then of course have a commercial QMS. And what I mean by that is the FDA calls it the phase appropriate QMS. They have guidance. Um, an example is the validation of methods. At preclinical, the methods just have to be sound. They don't need to be validated.
Mm.
And then as you go through phase 1, phase 2, and 3, the method validation, the method accuracy, the method itself becomes more and more robust until it's at the full commercial QMS stage. Um, so th that and things like what's another one? Each CDMO, each QMS actually requires quite a bit for commercial, but when you're at preclinical, you don't need something like a completed FMEA. It might
Mm.
be started, but it's
Right.
not completed. Your work instructions may be very development written, still documented, still approved appropriately, but you don't need to possibly have all the training that you will need once you get it into commercial, because the commercial production often uses quite a bit different people than you use in an R&D type of pilot lab, that type of work.
For sure.
So I guess it's really about documenting it in the QMS, aligning it with the FDA guidance and the EU guidance. They have expectations, what they expect at different clinical phase testing.
Hmm. What are some practical strategies for aligning QMS maturity with product life cycle?
Yeah, and it's similar to my prior answer, but a little different. It's really having a defined development roadmap. And what I mean by that is here is preclinical, and basically under it, here are the requirements or the guidance from the FDA phase appropriate guidance documents from the EU. And then next one, phase 1 or phase 1 and 2, what are those expectations? So laying out the expectations as you go through clinical, and making sure that the projects are following those would be the key. So it's really the development roadmap again. I think every core team or every project team that's on working with the sponsor from the CDMO, they really have to be trained. They have to understand here
Mm.
is what the commercial expectations are, and here is what the phase appropriate are. So I think a trained development project team, um, part of part of a roadmap, but I believe a structured way of doing design reviews. And when I
Hmm.
say design, I mean I'm at phase 1 now. I was preclinical. I'm at phase 1. Is the formulation design appropriate? And having the right SMEs, having that communication of technical people within the sponsor and the CDMO, ensuring that we're all moving in the right direction with the different steps in the process. And again, back to risk-based, we most people are using a risk-based assessment. So looking at what has been set as a risk early on, and have we mitigated it enough to move on to the next phase? Do we
Hmm.
need more work? So a risk-based prioritization, and then using whatever data we have or that is available during all this activity, and just looking at it to see, is this product robust enough, consistent enough for the phase that we're using, the scale that's being used for it.
Hmm. Let me zoom out a little bit. So, from a leadership standpoint, what would be your advice for fostering a culture where risk management, process robustness, and regulatory compliance are all embedded across teams?
Yeah, it's a hard one, especially with the cross-functional teams that you have on with working with the CDMO and with the sponsor on trying to get the asset to the next level. And I spoke about them earlier, but I truly believe a risk analysis, a risk assessment of the product variability, of equipment. Oftentimes with the sponsor will bring in a new piece of equipment to the CDMO. Well,
Mhm.
what risks does comes with that? What are the things? A deep dive into that so you don't have problems later, or at least you can assess if you'll have problems later. And I think it's super. So that's number one. Number two is subject matter expert true design reviews. Again, CDMO and sponsor, but to really look at together a formulation, for example. Here's the formulation design. Have
Mhm.
we missed anything? Are there anything the sponsor knows that the CDMO knows that we could improve? So getting a cross-functional subject matter expert team involved, along with the team that came up with the approach. And then I believe standard work. And what I mean by that is every sponsor works when they're working with CDMOs, you want to have the same experience with that project team. A project manager could leave for whatever reason. You
Mhm.
don't want to get another team from that CDMO that's going to do it totally different.
Mm, right.
Um, and also standard work, again, from a project management or a core team type of approach is something that the CDMO can talk to the sponsor about and prepare them and say, hey, we expect that the sponsor provide a detailed requirement of the product before we go to phase one or whatever that may be. So aligning expectations, you really need that standard work and discussion between CDMO and sponsor.
Mm, great. Let's talk about balance of speed to market, where with the rigor needed for regulatory compliance and risk mitigation. How do you balance that?
Yeah, I've mentioned a couple of comments where if the sponsor and CDMO miss key aspects of their submission. For example, the speed to market requires hold times that
Mm,
EU requires. If you don't do those hold times, what could happen is that the EU will kick that out, and now the sponsor and CDMO will have to repeat the process, get hold times, and typically do stability.
mm.
That's a pretty dramatic time.
Yeah, that
So
takes
again,
a
it goes,
while.
yeah, exactly. And so getting that clear, what are the hold times required?
Mm,
And even what is the stability required? Again, the sponsor may think 3 months is great, but if you talk to the FDA, they're going to say, no, for this type of product, we expect 6 to 9 or
mm,
12 or whatever it is. But getting that alignment, it's so critical. So working sponsor and the regulatory bodies they're working with, I think is critical. Um, I mentioned the CDMO sponsor communication. We there just has we everyone needs to be on the same playing field. So
mm,
having that great communication makes everything easier. The CDMO, if something happens, it's better to talk to the sponsor than to try to not talk to them and try other things and then surprise them at the end is never a good thing. So having that open communication is huge.
mm.
But yeah, those are kind of the main ones I've seen.
Yeah, a common theme I'm hearing is people don't plan to fail, they fail to plan. And getting a CDMO that has the experience in order to avoid those common pitfalls is invaluable.
Yeah,
So I guess that's probably a good segue into, your career leading multiple product approvals across drug and device lines. What advice would you give sponsors, you know, in summary, when trying to get it right is what they're trying to do the first time?
yeah, I think having the sponsor come in with to the best of their ability, here are the clear product requirements. And then sharing, here are the things we worry about. Um, for example, light sensitivity, whatever those things are, having that open communication. And then also from the CDMO side saying, hey, we've worked with products like this. Here are other things you should consider. Having that clear communication, it's okay. We're all in this together, right? Everyone wants the asset to get to the next level, the sponsor, the CDMO. And I think sometimes maybe the sponsor is holding things back, maybe the CDMO is holding things back, but having a discussion, especially around the product requirements and learnings from both sides, is just critical. I've also noticed more from the CDMO side, but also from the sponsor side, really getting a documented, clear quality agreement is critical. And what I mean by that is you want to make sure the expectations from both sides are aligned. For example, if there's a complaint, does the sponsor expect a response in 1 day, 3 days, 5 days? Or timing or who's approving certain documents. Having that robust, clear quality agreement just eliminates a lot of disagreements or miscommunications that could come up later in the project. So that's just a pain point that could happen between a sponsor and CDMO. A more tactical one, but one I know that can be irritating to any team working through the CDMO and sponsor is just there needs to be a rapid turnaround review time of documentation. One side or the other, it could take a lot of time that really, I think, causes irritation to the other side, and it just slows the project down. So having that gentleman agreement, if you call it up front, is also important.
Yeah. If I could just comment on those rapid responses, one way that I found that just kind of helps is making sure not necessarily an agreement on what that should be, but making sure that there are regularly scheduled meetings at certain intervals so that you're not sending emails randomly. It's on that weekly, bi-weekly, monthly agenda to say, hey, here's what we're still waiting on.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, because neither side, sponsor or CDMO, wants to be pelted with emails of here's another document, approve it,
Right.
And I'm a firm believer in having a meeting where you just talk through it. You can get a lot done rather than multiple email chains that sometimes aren't answered.
A lot of times too is those meetings help project the correct tone. Whereas I think tone can be misinterpreted when it's done over email, and that isn't something that's going to help a business relationship flourish.
You're exactly right.
Yeah.
And everyone has their own tone on emails anyway. So yes, talking is better.
Yeah, and I'll be honest. So I'm a very short responder generally, and I know that sometimes can be misinterpreted, right? So I have been using ChatGPT to help me lengthen, rather than 5 words. That sounds good, right? Just to, make it a sentence or 2 sentences, not so that it's, 3 paragraphs, but I know sometimes I could be a little short, so ChatGPT's been helping me out with my tone.
That's awesome. I'll
Yeah,
use that now.
yeah, feel free. Well, I didn't mean to interject. This has been an awesome podcast. Before we close, what would you like to leave the audience with?
I guess, after working 15, 20 years in the CDMO and sponsor, it's been fun. It's something new every day. I think the theme of it's better to communicate than to email. And it's also the criticality of documenting the body of knowledge. I mentioned FMEA, there's other ways, but I think those are the messages I give my teams here on you need to be clear, concise, but you also have to document items as things change. So no, it's a fun place to be a quality and development professional in the CDMO world right now. So
yeah, well, I'm sure everybody listening definitely got some useful tips in order to avoid a lot of those tragic delays. So among everything else that you've shared. So thank you so much, Jackie. And for everybody listening, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. Subscribe to get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast, and follow the FDA Group on LinkedIn for industry updates and cutting edge insights. If you would like to talk about project or resource needs, just head over to thefdagroup.com to get in touch, or feel free to connect with me personally on LinkedIn. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and we will see you in the next rundown.